Hello and welcome to In the Shadows, a bi-weekly podcast that shares paranormal stories from the 7 states and beyond. I'm your host, Noelle, and I'll be taking you on this guided tour into the dark and creepy. From creaking footsteps and odd shadows to unsettling buildings and strange lights. Each episode will have 2 strange tales of the unknown, but only one of them will have really happened. Each true account that is shared here is a personal tale that I've either experienced firsthand or has been shared with me by friends and family members. All names and locations have been changed to protect the information of everyone involved. Do you have a story you'd like to share? Send an email to podcastintheshadows@gmail.com or join our Facebook group In the Shadows Podcast to share your own tales of the supernatural. All personal stories, pictures, and videos are welcome and may be chosen with permission for an episode. Now, sit back, pull your blankets close, hold tight to your flashlight, and let's begin. Our first episode is titled, There's Something Weird About Cemeteries. Green eyes. My brothers and I were big lovers of exploring cemeteries in our teenage years. We would pile up late at night in our cousin's large van during the weekend, taking cameras and flashlights, and wander through the gravestones. We'd sometimes take pictures of each other, but mostly it would be of the stones and statues or anything interesting we could find. There were some spooky moments, but nothing to frighten us away. Mostly cold spots, whispers, and some shadows that really shouldn't have been obvious shadows. Nothing showed up on the pictures except dark, blurry stones, but there were sometimes vague wisps of white. It was my older brother who'd heard of a particular graveyard that had an interesting rumor. He wouldn't say what exactly that rumor was, but that weekend we all trundled up in the van and traveled 35 miles away to a particularly tiny graveyard that had seen its last inhabitant in the early 1900s. It had a rusted metal fence, with the old ruins of a church hovering about 70 to 80 yards away. The building was dark and decrepit in the gloom of the evening. After all the graveyards and cemeteries I'd visited, this was the first time that, as soon as I stepped over on that land, there was a sense of dread. It was a full moon, and there were few trees in the area, which meant the shadows were limited. There were no statues, just little square stones that jutted up from thick tufts of grass that came up to our ankles. I remember thinking someone really should take better care of the field, and wondered if we should worry about snakes. We looked about at first, just wandering about, looking at the dates, at the ages, wondering how these people may have passed. After all, in the 18 and 1900s, diseases were far more prominent and harder to get rid of. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes when we saw it. 2 bright green eyes staring at us from a field right beyond the fence of the graveyard. My brother admitted, after a little bit of hesitation, that he'd heard about the strange green eyes from a friend, but no one knew what caused them. At first we suggested it was a statue to him. Maybe some animal was nearby. Except it was obvious there was no statue in that field, and the trees were too far away. After further consideration, we realized those eyes, they were the right height for a human. After a bit more discussion, the only option we had was to investigate the situation. We'd report back to his brother's friend that we weren't cowards, and this little trick to prove otherwise had clearly failed. The 4 of us played rock, paper, scissors to decide who'd be the one to investigate, and I was the loser who had to walk towards those weird green eyes. Still worried about snakes, I took careful steps across the grass, mindful not to step on any of the fallen gravestones as I did. About 30 yards out, I stopped and asked, "Is this far enough?" But my cousin said, "No, go further." The eyes were still too far ahead. The further I went, the more that sensation of dread built, and I stopped at 50 yards to ask again, "Are you sure I haven't gone far enough?" Again, they said no. By now, I noticed the temperature had dropped, and I had goosebumps going along my arms. I told my brothers and cousins I was sure I'd gone far enough by now, but they told me, yelled at me really, to keep going. I reluctantly kept going until I had to be around 70 or 80 yards and was near the church at this point. I knew I had to be right on top of whatever was causing that effect, and it wouldn't have mattered even if I wasn't, because I was too scared to go any further. No, I was beyond scared. I was frozen in place. I don't know how long I stood there, but my younger brother came running at me, felt like hours later, yelling at the top of his lungs, "You're on top of it! You're on top of it!" as loud as he could at me, and I could tell he was just as frightened as I was. He grabbed my arm, yanking me back. Suddenly I was free of that stillness, of that freezing sensation. We both ran toward the van to catch up with the others. As he did, he told me the green eyes had been right above me, almost as if it was staring down at me, and he would swear that it was watching us the whole time. That's when he'd begun to run. In the van, the others said how it looked like the eyes had moved when I got closer. My cousin said he'd seen a white shape move from the church in my direction. He also said that he had this feeling that the shape meant to do something bad to me. We never did go back to that graveyard to find out exactly what caused the green eyes to appear. But when I was older, I drove by just on chance. It was during the day, and I was taking a shortcut between two nearby towns. As soon as I got close to that particular graveyard, that same terrible feeling of dread came up almost immediately. I sped up, nearly wrecking my car as a result, but that feeling, it lasted for minutes. I kept staring at my rearview mirror, wondering if I would see something. Nothing ever appeared. Either way, I made a point to never go down that road ever again. Leave now. There was a time I thought myself a paranormal investigator. It was the new big thing, hunting for ghosts and finding proof of the other side. With a video recorder, DSLR camera, and my good friend Nancy, we'd venture to areas that had been rumored to be haunted with hopes of catching something. Anything, really. We especially hoped we'd see something out there. It was Nancy's idea to visit an off-the-road graveyard along one of those old small towns somewhere between Tyler and Houston. She'd had something happen when visiting friends in that area. She swore she'd seen a child walking down a dirt road that led to a church that was still used on occasional Sundays. She also claimed to have the feeling of being watched as she passed by that church's graveyard on the way to see her friends. Would I like to go investigate it with her? We chose a warm Saturday afternoon to travel out there, our equipment charged up and ready, flashlights, phones, and emergency kit in the back of my old gray Saturn. Our husbands had suggested they go along, but we were so excited by the idea of having a paranormal girls' trip, and they'd just get in the way. Besides, we'd be back that evening, and if anything bad happened, well, her friend did just live a mile further down the road. There was some question about the safety of the dirt road, which was pitted and rough. I worried the bottom of my car would be knocked out. With some finessing, we made it to the church, which rested on our left, all dark brown wood, and an unwelcome feeling to the design of the building. It wasn't paranormal, only a heaviness of foreboding in its structure. To the right side of the road was the supposedly haunted graveyard. It was small, well cared for, with an assortment of limestone and marble marking the uniform graves. Some even had the personal fences that were meant to keep thieves out. We parked our car along the fence, out of the way of the gate. We stepped out of the vehicle and both agreed that almost immediately there was this feeling that someone was watching us from the field nearby. There were no homes near here, just trees acting as a border around the 4 acres of churchyard and burial ground. But we both had that sensation that our presence had been noted, and we were being investigated. Just as well, we were there to investigate the ground, so why shouldn't they be as curious about us as we were of their presence? Nancy took the video recorder, while I took photographs of the stones, many of which were darkened with age and hard to read. I could hear Nancy in the distance, asking if anyone was there and whether they'd like to come speak to us. She had the right idea of it, I decided, and pulled out my recorder to hopefully catch something. Well, anything that I could. A small bench sat close to an enclosed plot, one that read Mary Handel had passed in 1892 and was a dearly loved wife and mother. As I took my seat, I noted 2 lanterns that were hanging nearby from shepherd's hooks. There was no air to stir them, but they'd begun to swing on their own. Mildly at first, but with enough energy to make me question if someone was there. I called Nancy over to watch the situation, to see if they would swing for a while, or if it was maybe a mild breeze that I couldn't feel. In time, they stopped and didn't move again. Hours passed with no further notable interaction, but as the evening began to fall, it felt as if the area was slowly becoming more active. By now we had wandered deeper into the yard, closer to the church, where the older stones had turned into thin white columns. Our flashlights moved along these stones as we recorded ourselves. We were asking random questions and gave pauses, hoping somebody might answer and we would catch their response. Nancy, at this point, was in front of me, and she suddenly turned to grab my arm, which startled me. "Hannah," she whispered. Her finger pointed toward the church. It had large floodlights on each edge, and in the edge of one of those floodlights stood a shadowed figure, diminutive in size, but sharp enough for us to make out that it was a young girl in a dress. Nancy tried taking a picture. The camera buzzed to life, gave a pause, and then died on her. Earlier when we had checked it, which was only minutes before, it had nearly 50% life. "Use the voice recorder," I told her, as we carefully advanced in the direction of the shadow. As soon as we took 4 steps toward it, it melted away, and we went still again. "Hannah," Nancy said again, I think I hear something." As soon as she had said this, something cold grabbed hold of my arm, right above the elbow, and I went still. I swept my flashlight around and glanced behind me, but saw nothing but gravestones. The coldness disappeared quickly, but I could hear what she did. A low growl of annoyance. We had been there for hours, and now it felt as if we were pressing our luck. "Is someone here?" I asked in a shaky voice. Nothing answered, but I'd swear something or someone had stepped close enough that their face was nearly in mine. "Is someone here who wants to talk to us? Do you want us to leave?" The recorder gave a few angry beeps and followed in the way of the camera, dying on us. Oh yes, something was there. And yes, they very much wanted us to leave, because it was using our batteries, killing them off one by one. "Nancy, now is probably a good time to leave," I suggested anxiously, but she argued with the idea. "Just because it growled at us? That's a stupid idea." It took her battery flickering and dying out for her to quickly decide, "Or maybe we should go before we trip and hurt ourselves?" She didn't fool me. I could hear the tremble in her voice just as easily as my own. We tried to keep our pace calm but quick, letting whatever there was know that yes, we were leaving. Yes, we understood our time had finished, and thank you very much for letting us stay as long as we had. That presence followed us the whole way, a heavy demeanor that seemed to be pushing us with that built-up energy. It had left the hairs on our necks standing. As we neared the car, we saw that shadow again on the edge of the church's floodlights. It was the same little girl, we believed, but she was walking away from us, following the dirt path to the south. We watched until the shadow faded off into the darkness, then emerged again further down the road. Let's go home, I decided in disappointment, wishing my video recorder had been up and at the ready. Once I got inside the car, I was quick to turn it on with hopes that the shadow might appear again. But it was a moot desire. The recorder notified me it was at 3%, then went black. There was a thump on the trunk of the car, something telling us decidedly, "Leave now." We both shrieked in reaction and quickly turned the vehicle on. With that same effort, we made our way back along the dirt road, trying to dodge every pit hole and fall that we noticed. As we drove away, Nancy swore that she saw another shadow, not the little girl, but a different figure, watching us near the church. A tall, male figure who was watching us as we drove away. Thank you for joining us for our first ever episode of In the Shadows. Join us next time when we will share which story is real and why. In the meantime, good night, sleep tight, and don't let the ghouls bite.